The rain was coming down hard against the windows of the private jet as it touched down at the airport. Robert Chen looked at his watch and sighed. It was barely past 9 in the evening, but he felt like he had been traveling for days. The business meeting in Tokyo had ended earlier than expected, which meant he could finally go home to his family. As the car pulled up to his Manhattan penthouse building, Robert felt a familiar weight on his shoulders. Running a tech company worth billions wasn't easy, and lately it seemed like every day brought new problems to solve. His phone had been buzzing all day with messages from his team, but right now all he wanted was to see his wife and 6-month-old son. The elevator ride to the top floor felt longer than usual. Robert fumbled with his keys, trying to be quiet. His wife Victoria had mentioned she might go to that fancy spa upstate for a few days. She had been stressed lately, dealing with the baby and adjusting to motherhood. Robert couldn't blame her. Sometimes he wondered if they had been ready for a child at all. He pushed open the front door and stepped into the quiet apartment. The lights were dimmed and everything seemed peaceful. Too peaceful, actually. Usually little Tommy would be crying or making some kind of noise around this time. Robert set down his briefcase and loosened his tie, grateful for the silence but also slightly worried. Walking through the living room, he noticed Victoria's purse wasn't on the kitchen counter where she always left it. Her car keys were missing from the hook by the door too. She must have gone to that spa after all. Robert felt a small pang of disappointment. He had been looking forward to seeing his family, even if it was just for a few minutes before everyone went to bed. But then he heard something that made him stop in his tracks. It was singing, soft, gentle singing coming from down the hall. The voice was warm and melodic, definitely not Victoria's. Robert's first thought was that maybe Victoria had asked her sister to watch Tommy, but that didn't make sense either. Her sister lived in California. Curious and slightly concerned, Robert walked quietly down the hallway toward the nursery. The singing was getting clearer now. It was a lullaby sung in what sounded like Spanish. Robert recognized the voice, and it made his stomach tighten with confusion. It was Rosa, their housekeeper. Rosa had been working for them for almost 8 years, long before Tommy was born. She was reliable, quiet, and always did her job well. But what was she doing here so late at night? And why was she in the nursery? Robert approached the slightly open door and peered inside. What he saw made him freeze completely. Rosa was sitting in the rocking chair by the window, the one Victoria had picked out when they first decorated the nursery. She was holding Tommy in her arms, and the baby was nursing. Actually nursing. Rosa was breastfeeding his son. Robert's mind went blank for a moment. He couldn't process what he was seeing. 1,000 thoughts raced through his head all at once. Anger, confusion, shock, and something else he couldn't quite identify. He stood there, hidden in the shadow of the doorway, watching this incredibly intimate scene unfold in front of him. Tommy looked peaceful and content in Rosa's arms. More content than Robert had seen him in weeks, actually. The baby had been fussy lately, crying a lot and refusing bottles. Victoria had been at her wits' end trying to figure out what was wrong. But here he was, calm and quiet, being cared for by their housekeeper. Rosa continued singing softly, her voice filled with tenderness and love. She looked down at Tommy with the same expression Robert had seen on Victoria's face when she looked at their son. It was pure maternal love, protective and gentle, but Rosa wasn't Tommy's mother. She was their employee. Robert felt his anger building. How dare she? How could she take such liberties with his child? This was completely inappropriate, crossing every boundary between employer and employee. He should march in there right now and demand an explanation. He should fire her on the spot, but something held him back. Maybe it was the peaceful expression on Tommy's face or the gentle way Rosa was holding him. Maybe it was the realization that his son was finally eating after days of refusing bottles. Robert had heard Victoria on the phone with the pediatrician just 2 days ago, worried because Tommy wasn't gaining weight properly. As he watched, Rosa carefully lifted Tommy to her shoulder and began patting his back gently. The baby let out a small burp, and Rosa smiled, whispering something in Spanish that Robert couldn't understand. Everything about her movements was natural and practiced, like she had done this 1,000 times before. That's when Robert noticed something else. Rosa looked tired, more tired than usual. There were dark circles under her eyes, and her face looked thinner than he remembered. When was the last time he had really looked at her? really seen her as a person instead of just someone who cleaned his house and did his laundry. He realized he knew almost nothing about Rosa's personal life. He knew she lived somewhere in Queens and he thought she might have a family, but they had never talked about it. In 8 years of working for them, their conversations had been limited to household matters and schedules. She was just Rosa, the quiet woman who made their lives easier by keeping their home running smoothly. But here she was, caring for his son with a tenderness that spoke of deep maternal instinct. This wasn't just a housekeeper doing her job. This was a mother taking care of a baby who needed her. Tommy had fallen asleep in Rosa's arms, his tiny fist curled against her shoulder. Rosa stood up slowly, moving with careful precision to avoid waking him. She walked to the crib and gently laid him down, covering him with the soft blue blanket Victoria's mother had made. She stood there for a moment watching him sleep, before quietly gathering up the empty bottles that were scattered around the room. Robert finally stepped back from the doorway, his mind reeling. He needed time to think, to process what he had just witnessed. He walked back to the kitchen and poured himself a glass of water, his hands shaking slightly. What was he supposed to do now? Confront Rosa immediately? Wait until morning? Call Victoria and tell her what had happened? He wasn't even sure what had happened exactly. All he knew was that his son had been hungry, crying, refusing bottles, and somehow Rosa had found a way to help him. As he stood there in his expensive kitchen, surrounded by all the luxuries his wealth could buy, Robert felt something he hadn't experienced in years. He felt completely out of his depth, unsure of what the right thing to do was. For once, his money and power couldn't provide him with an easy answer. Tomorrow, he would have to face Rosa and ask her to explain herself. But tonight, for the first time in days, his son was sleeping peacefully. And that had to count for something. Robert barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Rosa holding Tommy, singing that gentle lullaby. He kept replaying the scene over and over, trying to make sense of what he had witnessed. By the time morning came, he had gone through every possible emotion: anger, confusion, gratitude, and something else he couldn't quite name. He got up early and made coffee, something he rarely did anymore. Usually Rosa would have fresh coffee ready by the time he woke up, along with the newspaper and his breakfast. But today felt different. Today everything had changed. Around 7:30 he heard Rosa's key in the front door. She always arrived early before anyone else was awake. Robert listened to her quiet footsteps as she moved through the apartment, probably starting her usual morning routine. He wondered if she knew he was home. His car was in the garage, but she might not have noticed it yet. Robert sat at the kitchen table, gripping his coffee mug and rehearsing what he would say. He had to handle this carefully. What Rosa had done was inappropriate, but Tommy had been happy and well-fed for the first time in days. That had to mean something. "Good morning, Mr. Chen." Rosa's voice came from behind him. She sounded surprised. "I didn't know you were back from your trip." Robert turned around slowly. Rosa stood in the doorway wearing her usual simple dress and apron. She looked nervous, her hands fidgeting with the cleaning supplies she was carrying. Did she know that he had seen her last night? "Good morning, Rosa," Robert said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Could you sit down for a minute? I need to talk to you about something." The color drained from Rosa's face. She set down her supplies and walked to the table like she was walking to her own execution. Her hands were shaking as she pulled out a chair and sat down across from him. "Is everything okay?" she asked quietly, though her expression suggested she already knew the answer. Robert looked at her closely for the first time in years. Really looked at her. Rosa was probably in her 40s, though it was hard to tell. Her dark hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her clothes were clean but worn. She had kind eyes, the kind that had seen hardship but still held warmth. When was the last time he had actually seen her as a person? "I came home last night," Robert began, watching Rosa's face carefully. Earlier than planned, Rosa's eyes widened slightly and she looked down at her hands. "I see. I heard singing coming from Tommy's room." Robert paused, giving her a chance to explain. "I looked inside and I saw you. With my son." Rosa's shoulders sagged and she closed her eyes. When she opened them again, there were tears starting to form. "Mr. Chen, I can explain." "Please let me explain." "I'm listening," Robert said, though his voice was tighter than he intended. Rosa took a shaky breath and began to speak. Tommy was crying all day yesterday. Mrs. Chen left for her trip in the morning, and after she left, he wouldn't stop crying. He wouldn't take the bottle, wouldn't eat anything. I tried everything, rocking him, singing to him, walking around the apartment. Nothing worked? Robert remembered the pediatrician's concerns about Tommy's weight. The baby had been losing weight instead of gaining it, and Victoria had been worried sick. I called Mrs. Chen, Rosa continued, but she said to keep trying with the bottle. But he just wouldn't take it. By evening, he had been crying for hours. I was so worried about him. He was getting weak and dehydrated. So you decided to... Robert couldn't finish the sentence. I had no choice, Rosa said, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. My daughter, she's 8 months old. I'm still nursing her. I knew I could help Tommy, but I also knew it was wrong. I knew you would be angry, but he was so hungry, Mr. Chen. So hungry and scared. Robert felt like the air had been knocked out of his lungs. Rosa had a daughter, an 8-month-old daughter. In 8 years of working for them, he had never known this basic fact about her life. You have a daughter? He asked, his voice softer now. Rosa nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. Her name is Isabella. Bella. She lives with my mother in Queens while I work. Where is her father? Robert asked, though he immediately regretted the personal question. He left when I told him I was pregnant, Rosa said simply. It's just me and Bella now. And my mother, but she's getting old. She can't work anymore. Robert sat back in his chair trying to process this information. Rosa was a single mother, supporting a baby and an elderly parent on a housekeeper's salary. No wonder she always looked tired. Rosa, why didn't you ever tell us about your daughter? Robert asked. Rosa looked surprised by the question. You never asked, Mr. Chen. In 8 years, no one ever asked about my family. The truth of that statement hit Robert like a punch to the stomach. She was right. In 8 years, he had never once asked Rosa about her life outside of their apartment. He knew nothing about her hopes, her struggles, her family. She had been invisible to him, just a pair of hands that cleaned his house and did his laundry. Tell me about her, Robert said quietly. Tell me about Bella. Rosa's face brightened slightly, the way any mother's face lights up when talking about her child. She's beautiful, so smart and curious about everything. She's starting to crawl now, getting into everything. My mother says she looks just like me when I was a baby. Is she healthy? Robert asked. Rosa's expression darkened. She was born with a heart problem. The doctors say she needs surgery, but... She trailed off, looking embarrassed. But what? The insurance I have doesn't cover everything. The surgery costs more money than I make in 2 years. I've been trying to save up, working extra jobs on weekends, but it's not enough. The doctors say we can't wait much longer. Robert felt sick to his stomach. While he spent money on expensive cars and designer clothes without thinking twice, Rosa was desperately trying to save her daughter's life with the small salary he paid her. How much does the surgery cost? He asked. Rosa shook her head. It doesn't matter, Mr. Chen. I'm not asking for money. I'm just trying to explain why I did what I did last night. I know it was wrong. I know I crossed a line. But when I saw Tommy suffering and I knew I could help him, I couldn't just let him starve. You're not asking for money? Robert repeated, confused. No, sir. I never ask for handouts. I work for what I earn. I made a mistake last night, and I understand if you want to fire me. I've already started looking for other jobs just in case. Robert stared at Rosa, this woman who had cared for his family for 8 years, who had risked her job to help his son, who was facing her own child's medical crisis and still refused to ask for help. He felt ashamed of himself in a way he had never experienced before. Rosa, he said slowly, you didn't make a mistake last night. You saved my son. Rosa looked up at him with surprise and confusion. Tommy has been losing weight, Robert continued. The doctors were worried. Victoria was worried. And you found a way to help him when no one else could. But it was inappropriate, Rosa protested. I overstepped my boundaries. Maybe, Robert said. But sometimes the right thing to do isn't the same as the appropriate thing to do. They sat in silence for a moment, both lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Robert spoke again. I want to know more about your daughter's condition. Can you bring me the medical records? Rosa looked confused. Why? Because, Robert said, it's time I started acting like the person I always thought I was, instead of the person I've actually been. After Rosa left that morning, Robert sat alone in his kitchen for a long time. The conversation had shaken him more than he wanted to admit. For the first time in years, he felt like he was really seeing the world around him instead of just moving through it in his wealthy bubble. He pulled out his phone and called his assistant. "David, I need you to do something for me, and I need you to keep it completely confidential." "Of course, Mr. Chen, what do you need?" "I want you to gather some information about Rosa Martinez, our housekeeper. I need to know about her employment history, her family situation, everything. But I want you to be discreet about it. Don't let anyone know what you're doing." David paused for a moment. "Is there a problem with Rosa? She's been with your family for a long time." "No problem," Robert said quickly. "I just need to understand some things better." After hanging up, Robert went to check on Tommy. The baby was still sleeping peacefully, looking healthier than he had in weeks. Rosa had left a note next to the crib with feeding instructions and her personal phone number, in case of emergencies. Even after their conversation, she was still thinking about Tommy's well-being. Robert picked up the note and studied Rosa's handwriting. It was neat and careful, the writing of someone who took pride in doing things properly. At the bottom, she had written, "Thank you for listening to me this morning. I will understand whatever decision you make." Over the next few days, Robert found himself watching Rosa differently. He noticed how gently she handled Tommy's toys when she cleaned the nursery. He saw how she always made sure the baby's room was perfectly organized, with everything exactly where Victoria liked it. He observed the way she hummed quietly while she worked, the same gentle tunes she had been singing to Tommy that night. David's research came back 3 days later, and what Robert learned made him feel even worse about himself. Rosa had been working 2 additional jobs on weekends, cleaning offices and babysitting for other families. She had never missed a day of work in 8 years, never asked for a raise, never complained about anything. Her references from previous employers all said the same thing. Rosa was honest, hardworking, and trustworthy. But the most shocking discovery was about her daughter's medical condition. David had managed to get copies of the medical records that Rosa had signed releases for. Baby Isabella had been born with a serious heart defect that required immediate surgery. The operation would cost almost $200,000, and Rosa's insurance would only cover about $40,000 of it. Robert stared at the numbers on the page. $200,000. That was less than what he had spent on his last vacation. It was a fraction of what he paid for his car. For Rosa, it might as well have been $2 million. He kept reading and discovered something else that made his chest tighten. Rosa had been slowly selling her possessions to raise money for the surgery. She had sold her car, her jewelry, even her furniture. She was now taking 3 buses each way to get to work because she couldn't afford transportation. David had also found out that Rosa's mother was sick with diabetes and needed expensive medication. Rosa was supporting both her daughter and her mother on her salary from the Chen family, plus whatever she could make from her weekend jobs. Robert closed the file and walked to his office window. Outside, the city bustled with life. People hurrying to work, tourists taking pictures, everyone focused on their own lives and problems. He wondered how many other Rosas were out there, struggling quietly while people like him lived in oblivious luxury. That evening, Victoria called from the spa. "How's Tommy doing?" she asked. "Is he still being fussy about eating?" Robert looked over at his son, who was playing happily in his bouncy seat. "Actually, he's been much better. Rosa figured out a way to help him." "Oh, good. Rosa is wonderful with him. I don't know what we'd do without her." After hanging up, Robert realized that Victoria genuinely cared about Rosa and appreciated her work. But like him, she had never bothered to learn about Rosa's personal life. They both saw her as a valuable employee, but not as a complete person with her own struggles and dreams. The next morning, Robert did something he had never done before. Instead of leaving for work early, he waited for Rosa to arrive. When she came in, he asked her to sit down with him again. "I've been thinking about our conversation," he said. "About your daughter." Rosa nodded, looking nervous. "I brought the medical records you asked for," she said, pulling a thick envelope from her purse. "And overwhelming gratitude." "I don't know if I can do it," she said quietly. "Running a foundation is a big responsibility." "You've been taking care of my family for 8 years," Robert said. "You've been managing your own family's needs with almost no resources. You've been solving problems and making hard decisions every day. You're more qualified than you think. Robert reached across the table and took Rosa's hand. Rosa, I'm not asking you to do this as a favor to me. I'm asking because I genuinely believe you're the right person for the job. And because I think this could be something amazing. Rosa looked down at their joined hands, then back up at Robert's face. If I said yes, she said carefully, what would happen to Isabella's surgery? The Foundation's first case would be helping a little girl named Isabella Martinez get the heart surgery she needs. Robert said with a smile. Consider it our inaugural project. For the first time since the conversation began, Rosa smiled back. You really think I could do this? Help other families like mine? I don't just think you could do it, Robert said. I think you'll be brilliant at it. Rosa took a deep breath and nodded slowly. Okay, she said. Yes, I'll try. Robert felt a surge of excitement and satisfaction that he hadn't experienced in years. This felt right in a way that none of his business deals ever had. There's just one condition, Rosa said, looking serious again. What's that? I still want to help take care of Tommy sometimes. That little boy has become very important to me. Robert laughed, feeling lighter than he had in months. I think that can be arranged. 6 months later, Robert stood in the bright, cheerful waiting room of the Children's Heart Center, watching Isabella take her first steps. The little girl tottered unsteadily between Rosa and the physical therapist. Her face lit up with pure joy. Her surgery had been a complete success, and now, at 14 months old, she was finally strong enough to walk. Come on, Bella, Rosa called out, her arms stretched wide. Come to Mama. Isabella giggled and took 3 wobbling steps before falling into Rosa's arms. The room erupted in applause from the other families who were there for their own children's appointments. Robert found himself clapping too, with tears in his eyes. It had been an incredible 6 months. The Rosa Martinez Foundation for Children's Healthcare had officially launched 3 months ago, and already they had helped 47 families pay for medical treatments their children needed. Rosa had thrown herself into the work with a passion and dedication that amazed everyone who met her. She had also surprised everyone, including herself, with how naturally leadership came to her. The team Robert had hired to support her, lawyers, administrators, medical consultants, all spoke of Rosa with deep respect. She had an intuitive understanding of what families needed and a gift for cutting through bureaucracy to get things done quickly. Mr. Chen, Isabella's voice broke through his thoughts. The little girl had spotted him and was reaching her arms up toward him. Robert knelt down and scooped her up, marveling at how healthy and strong she felt. When he had first met Isabella the day before her surgery, she had been pale and tired, barely able to sit up. Now she was a normal, energetic toddler who seemed to find joy in everything. She remembers you, Rosa said, smiling as she watched Robert and Isabella together. You're one of her favorite people. It was true. Robert had become a regular visitor to Rosa's family, something that would have seemed impossible a year ago. He had attended Isabella's surgery, visited during her recovery, and celebrated every milestone in her healing process. He had also gotten to know Rosa's mother, Carmen, who had become like a grandmother to Tommy. Their relationships had changed all of their lives in ways Robert was still discovering. How was the board meeting yesterday? Rosa asked as they walked toward the parking garage. Good, Robert said, adjusting Isabella on his hip. We approved funding for 12 more families this month, including that little boy in Texas who needs the brain surgery. The Foundation's board met monthly to review applications and approve funding. Robert had intentionally kept the board small and focused on people who shared their mission. Besides himself and Rosa, it included a pediatric surgeon, a social worker, and 2 parents whose children had benefited from the Foundation's help. I still can't believe we're helping so many people, Rosa said, shaking her head. Sometimes I wake up and think it's all a dream. It's not a dream, Robert said. It's what happens when someone with a good heart gets the resources to follow it. They reached Rosa's car, a reliable sedan that the Foundation had helped her purchase. She was still careful with money, still thoughtful about every expense, but she no longer had to choose between bus fare and groceries. Are you coming to Tommy's birthday party on Saturday? Rosa asked as she buckled Isabella into her car seat. I wouldn't miss it, Robert said. Victoria's been planning it for weeks. The relationship between Rosa and Victoria had evolved too. When Victoria returned from her spa trip, and learned about everything that had happened, she had been shocked, then guilty, then deeply supportive. She now considered Rosa one of her closest friends, and the two women often spent time together with their children. Victoria had also gotten involved with the foundation, using her social connections to organize fundraising events and raise awareness about children's healthcare needs. She brought a different set of skills to the work, and her enthusiasm had helped expand their reach significantly. "I need to get back to the office," Rosa said. "We have 3 new applications to review, and I want to read through them carefully before tomorrow's meeting." Robert watched Rosa drive away, still amazed by the transformation he had witnessed. Not just in Rosa, though her confidence and leadership had blossomed in ways that surprised everyone. The bigger transformation had been in himself. His business was doing better than ever, partly because he had learned to delegate more and focus on what really mattered. His relationship with Victoria had improved as they found shared purpose in the foundation's work. But most importantly, his relationship with Tommy had become the center of his life in a way he never expected. He drove home thinking about how dramatically everything had changed since that night when he found Rosa nursing Tommy. At the time, he had been shocked and confused. Now he understood that he had witnessed something profound, the power of one person's compassion to change everything. When he got home, he found Victoria and Tommy in the living room reading a book together. Tommy spotted him immediately and crawled over as fast as his little legs could carry him. "Dada!" Tommy called out, pulling himself up on Robert's legs. Robert lifted his son into his arms, breathing in that sweet baby smell that he had learned to treasure. Tommy was thriving now, growing and developing exactly as he should. But more than that, he was happy. The fussiness and crying that had worried everyone 6 months ago had disappeared completely. "How did the doctor's visit go?" Victoria asked, looking up from her book. "Isabella took her first steps today," Robert said, his voice full of pride. "You should have seen Rosa's face," Victoria smiled. "I can imagine. That family has been through so much." "Speaking of which," Robert said, "I have some news about the foundation." "Good news, I hope." "The best kind," Robert said, settling onto the couch with Tommy still in his arms. "We got approval for the expansion grant. Starting next month, we'll be able to help families in 3 more states." Victoria's eyes lit up. "That's wonderful. How many more children will we be able to help?" "If our calculations are right, about 200 families in the first year," Robert said. "Maybe more." They sat together in comfortable silence for a while, Tommy playing with his toys on the floor between them. Robert found himself thinking about all the families they had already helped, and all the ones they would help in the future. Each case was different, but they all had one thing in common: parents who would do anything to save their children's lives. Just like Rosa had been willing to risk her job to feed Tommy when he was hungry. "I was thinking," Victoria said quietly, "about what we should say at Tommy's birthday party, about how grateful we are for everything that's happened this year." Robert nodded. He had been thinking about the same thing. How do you explain to people that your life completely changed because your housekeeper showed you what real love looks like? "I think," he said finally, "we should talk about how the best things in life happen when people care about each other more than they care about rules or expectations." Victoria smiled and reached over to take his hand. "That sounds perfect." As the evening wore on, Robert reflected on how different his life was now compared to a year ago. He still lived in the same apartment, still ran the same company, still had more money than he could ever spend. But everything felt different because he finally understood what all of it was for. It wasn't for accumulating more wealth or buying more things. It was for moments like this, holding his healthy son, planning ways to help other families, being part of something bigger than himself. The foundation had grown beyond anything he had originally imagined. They were developing partnerships with hospitals, creating programs for long-term support, and even lobbying for better insurance coverage for children's medical needs. Rosa had become a respected voice in the field, speaking at conferences and consulting with other organizations. But the real success wasn't measured in numbers or programs. It was measured in children like Isabella, taking their first steps after life-saving surgery. It was measured in families who no longer had to choose between medical care and financial survival. It was measured in the hope that replaced desperation in parents' eyes. Later that night, after Tommy was asleep and Victoria had gone to bed, Robert stood in his son's nursery. It was the same room where everything had started, where Rosa's act of compassion had opened his eyes to a world beyond his own privilege. He thought about Rosa, probably at home reading bedtime stories to Isabella. He thought about all the families across the country who were sleeping peacefully because their children had received the medical care they needed. He thought about the ripple effects of kindness, how one person's willingness to help could change everything. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new families to help, new ways to make a difference. But tonight, Robert felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the deep satisfaction of knowing that his life had real meaning and purpose. It had all started with a simple act of love, a mother feeding a hungry child. Sometimes the most powerful transformations begin with the smallest gestures of care.